The air inside main radio on the USS California was a stagnant soup of ozone, burnt tobacco, and the acidic bite of Navy coffee that had been simmering for hours. It was 07:55 on a Sunday morning, a time of ritualized lethargy. Radiomen sat hunched over their mills. The heavy typewriters used to transcribe the rhythmic, high-piping chirps of the fleet broadcast. Their ears were encased in sweat-slicked Bakelite earphones. They were the Dihedar people, an insular guild of technicians who operated in a world of brass keys and glowing vacuum tubes. They were shielded from the humid Honolulu morning by several inches of armored steel. The ship, a 32,000-ton behemoth affectionately nicknamed the Prune Barge, sat motionless at her berth. She was a monument to a battleship culture that viewed itself as invulnerable. Then the world tilted. The first torpedo strike was not a sound so much as a violent, tectonic shudder that rippled through the hull. It jarred the heavy transmitters in their racks and sent coffee mugs shattering against the deck. The lights flickered, died, and then gasped back to life in a sickly, artificial yellow. Almost instantly, the routine announcements of the PA system were replaced by the frantic, rhythmic clanging of general quarters. As the heavy armored hatches were slammed shut and dogged down to establish Condition Z, a terrifying realization began to circulate through the lower decks. The California was not just a fortress, she was a steel coffin. To prepare for a scheduled inspection the following day, the manhole covers for the torpedo defense system had been left open. The watertight integrity of the ship was a total illusion. Water did not just leak in, it surged through the internal guts of the vessel, bypassing the very defenses designed to keep her upright. In the claustrophobic dimness of the radio room, the men looked up at the ominously smooth underside of the armored hatch above them. There were no escape routes. They were trapped in a mechanical tomb of their own leadership's making. They listened to the muffled banshee wail of Japanese dive bombers and the insane roar of the USS Arizona erupting just a few hundred yards away. The battleship era, with all its aesthetic pride and graceful white steel, was dying in the oily mud of the harbor. For the young men in the radio gang, the transition from a boring Sunday morning to a front-row seat at the end of the world had taken less than 60 seconds. But to understand how these boys ended up in this mechanical tomb, we must look back 18 months to a different kind of desperation. The road to this slaughterhouse began in 1940, born from the cold, hollow reality of the Great Depression. For a 19-year-old from the rural dust of Placerville, the Navy was not a calling. It was an escape from manual labor and a collapsed economy. These were the volunteers of the Communication Reserve, 30 young men who arrived at the San Diego Naval Training Station on August 2, 1940. They still smelled of civilian life, but that was about to be stripped away. The transition was a radical, impersonal breaking of the soul. It began at midnight in the barracks, where a cacophony of snoring and moans signaled the death of individuality. By 05:45, the screaming of the revel whistle thrust them onto the grinder. This was an asphalt purgatory, where the sun baked the smell of salt and mothballs into their new denim uniforms. On the grinder, life was measured by the rhythmic, heel-slapping cadence of marching boots and the terrifying whim of a salty boatswain's mate. This was the forge of the men o' war's men, a place where common sense was a liability and obedience was the only currency. To prove the point, a drill instructor once marched his entire platoon straight into the waters of the bay. The recruits waded chest-deep in their dress whites simply because no order had been given to stop. They were no longer sons or citizens, they were numbered cogs in a machine governed by the Blue Jackets manual. They spent their days mastering the wrist and the fist, hammering out Morse code until their fingers cramped. They struggled to reach the 18-word-per-minute standard required to copy the fleet broadcast. They lived on 39-cent rations and sipped canned milk-sweetened coffee from handleless mugs. Their world shrank to the size of a radio key and the weight of a Springfield 1903 rifle. By October 6, 1940, the transformation was complete, but their final destination remained a matter of blind chance. The recruits stood before a blackboard, where a list of ships was scrawled in white chalk. These were the names of vessels that would soon become either their homes or their headstones. There was no strategic counseling or assessment of skill. It was a casual, fateful selection. A finger pointed to the USS California, and a name was checked off. In that moment, a decision as trivial as a coin toss determined who would eventually return to the hills of California, and who would remain forever in the dark, flooded passageways of a sinking flagship. They boarded the Oiler Near Show for the transit to Hawaii, watching the white wake boil behind them as they left the States for the last time. They were unaware that the country club navy they were joining was a facade. It was a dream of security that was already beginning to dissolve. The Neosho had been a merchant-style transition, a slow-rolling vessel where the rules felt like suggestions rather than commandments. But, as the whaleboats pulled alongside the towering, grey hull of the USS California, that illusion of casualness vanished. To a young reserve sailor looking up from the waterline, the ship did not look like a vessel. It looked like a walled medieval city of steel. It was a fortress rising out of the turquoise Pacific, with an air of cold, predatory indifference. This was the flagship of the Battle Force, a 32,000-ton sovereign territory governed by the rocks and shoals. Reporting aboard was a psychological shearing. Stepping onto the teak-planked quarterdeck, the recruit was met by the sharp, rhythmic snap of a Marine sentry's salute. He felt the piercing, basalt-eyed gaze of the officer of the deck. In this moment, the civilian world of Placerville was incinerated. The sailor saluted the national ensign at the stern, and then the officer, a ritualized submission to a hierarchy that had existed since the days of sail. Beneath the graceful tripod masts and the majestic 14-inch gun turrets, the California was a labyrinth of guarded fiefdoms. It was a feudal society where geography was destiny. If you were a deck ape, your world was the salt-sprayed expanse of the topside. If you were a snipe in the Black Gang, you lived in a subterranean hell of 600-degree steam lines and the deafening roar of the turbo-electric drive. These divisions were tribal, insular, and fiercely protective. A radio man entering a machine shop was viewed with the same suspicion as a traveler crossing a hostile border without a passport. The social glue of this city was not camaraderie, but a rigid caste system. At the top sat the regular officers, men whose lives were dictated by the pursuit of a 4-0 fitness report. Below them were the 90-day wonder reserve officers, often treated with contempt by the true masters of the ship. Those masters were the chief petty officers. These were the high priests of the naval guilds, men like Chief Radioman Thomas J. Reeves. Reeves reigned over the radio shacks, with the persona of a riverboat gambler. A chief's word was more immediate than any admiral's command. They were the repositories of technical mystery and the final arbiters of a sailor's daily survival. They thought the walls of this floating city would protect them forever. They had no idea that the very bureaucracy they served was building a trap that would soon be sprung in the early morning light of December. The first meal in the enlisted mess was the final initiation into this mystic brotherhood. The air was a thick and humid soup of scorched split-pea soup, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of painted steel. There were no chairs, only narrow wooden benches where men sat shoulder to shoulder in a silence broken only by the clatter of heavy ceramic mugs. The mess cooks served ground meat sauce on toast, a rhythmic slop of heavy food onto metal trays. To a green reserve striker, the mess deck was a place of silent and heavy judgment. A seasoned boatswain's mate, his skin the color of old leather and mapped with faded tattoos of anchors and dragons, would watch the newcomer with a malevolent, unblinking stare. There was no welcome aboard. There was only the Aleutian stare, a look of profound, soul-deep boredom and hard-won cynicism. It signaled that you were an interloper in a world that had been running perfectly well before you arrived and would continue long after you were gone. This battleship culture was an aesthetic of obsession, masking a profound strategic obsolescence. The ship was beautiful in a way that felt holy, defined by the austere beauty of the long-barreled guns and the geometric precision of the folding white hats. But the reality of life inside the steel skin was dehumanizing. Sailors slept in canvas hammocks, slung so close to the overhead that the smell of the ship's vents was a constant suffocating presence. It was a mix of rancid sweat and carbon dioxide. The ship's public address system was the voice of a god that never slept, demanding a cycle of spit-shining shoes and holystoning decks that served no purpose other than the maintenance of an iron-fisted discipline. The ship's secondary battery of 51 caliber guns, intended to speak death to any surface challenger, was useless against the modern reality of the dive bomber. The men lived in steel coffins, compartments designed for a war that no longer existed. The armored hatches loomed above them like the lids of tombs. They were trapped in a dream of invincibility, a feudal city at sea that demanded their total assimilation. They were unaware that the very rigidness of their world was the very thing that would soon trap them in the dark, rising waters of a harbor they believed was a sanctuary. But to understand this coming slaughter, we must look at how the fleet became a captive of its own propaganda. By the spring of 1941, the Pacific Fleet was a 32,000-ton collection of steel monuments, anchored in a geographic mousetrap. Admiral James O. Richardson had seen the danger clearly, shouting his warnings into the mahogany-lined rooms of Washington until he was silenced by a presidential dismissal. He knew that by tethering the fleet to the shallow locks of Pearl Harbor, the Navy was trading strategic mobility for a target-rich environment. But as the California swung lazily at her moorings, the command climate remained obsessed with the spit and polish theater of a peacetime bureaucracy. The officers' wardrooms were sanctuaries of green baize tables and the delicate clink of silver coffee services. The looming threat of the Japanese Empire was discussed with the casual, patronizing air of a colonial master. To the gun club elite, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a Gilbert and Sullivan parody. They saw a collection of toy ships manned by nearsighted pilots who lacked the mechanical soul required for modern aerial combat. This institutional arrogance was cemented by the glossy pages of national magazines, where Pearl Harbor was painted as an impregnable fortress. It was a lie that the sailors of the California swallowed as readily as their morning Navy Joe. The collision between this American hubris and the cold, bleeding reality of modern war arrived in the form of a ghost from the Mediterranean. When the British battleship Warspite limped into the harbor, her hull was scarred by the jagged, blackened teeth of German bomb fragments. On a humid afternoon, a group of American sailors and officers boarded the rust-streaked Liverpool to survey the damage of a war they had only read about in dispatches. The contrast was a sensory shock. The California smelled of fresh paint and floor wax, but the Liverpool smelled of scorched electrical insulation, stale seawater, and the lingering metallic tang of dried blood. In a cramped, dimly lit compartment, a battle-hardened British leading seaman stood before the clean-shaven Americans. He had seen the sky over Crete turn black with German dive bombers. He pointed to the mangled remains of his ship's anti-aircraft battery, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The problem, mates," he whispered, "is that there's just not enough ack-ack. Never enough." He spoke of the screaming banshee sound of a dive bomber, a noise that could liquefy the bowels of the bravest man. The American officers, resplendent in their starched whites, listened with a polite, condescending detachment. They looked at the British sailor's frayed uniform and the desperate weariness in his eyes, and they saw failure instead of experience. They believed their own 5-inch guns and the austere beauty of their 14-inch turrets were sufficient to deter any threat from the east. They laughed off the warning as the pessimism of a defeated empire. They retreated back to the California to worry about the next inspection of the Brightwork, oblivious to the fact that the British were not describing a battle, but a prophecy. This racism of underestimation was the fleet's true Achilles heel. The Navy's intelligence circles were intoxicated by the myth that the Japanese were mere imitators, incapable of innovation. In the radio shacks and the engine rooms, the rumors echoed the headlines. The sailors whispered that Japanese pilots couldn't fly at night. Their torpedoes were duds, and their carriers would capsize in a heavy swell. This cultural blindness created a lethal inertia. While the California's crew practiced abandoned ship drills, as if they were a dark comedy of errors, the Japanese were perfecting the shallow water torpedo run in the bays of Kyushu. The Americans were training for a 17th century line of battle engagement. They envisioned a majestic display of national power, where ships would exchange broadsides like gentlemen. They ignored the coming storm, preferring the country club atmosphere of Honolulu, where the only conflict was a nightly brawl on Hotel Street. By the time the declaration of an unlimited national emergency arrived, the California was a barnacle-encrusted grey whale. Her speed was cut by marine growth, and her leadership was paralyzed by a business-as-usual mentality. The ship sat with her internal manhole covers open for a Monday morning inspection. Her ammunition was locked away and her boilers were cold. The mousetrap was set. The sailors lived in a state of boisterous innocence, fueled by the music of Glenn Miller and the security of a national myth. They never realized that their unquestioning faith in the impregnable harbor was the very thing that had rendered them defenseless. They were lions led by bureaucrats, standing on the deck of a doomed world. They watched the horizon for a war they refused to believe could ever reach their sanctuary. The declaration of an unlimited national emergency in May 1941 did not arrive with a thunderclap. It came with the steady, suffocating tightening of a bureaucratic vice. For the crew of the California, the transition to a war footing was personified by the arrival of Captain Joel W. Bunkley. He was a gun club traditionalist of the old school, a man whose eyes were as bleak and unyielding as polished basalt. Under his command, The ship's atmosphere shifted from the relaxed country club lethargy of the previous year to a draconian regime of naval justice. Bunkley prioritized the 14-inch guns and the ritual of the brig over the messy human realities of ship management. Alongside him stood the executive officer, Oliver F. Naquin, a man already haunted by the ghost of the Squalus disaster. To the superstitious sailors in the lower decks, these men were Jonahs, living conduits of catastrophe. But to understand the roots of this psychological dread, we must look back to the morning of January 9, 1941. California was maneuvering to depart for Hawaii, her massive hull vibrating with the power of her turbo-electric drive, when the world seemed to grind to a violent, screeching halt. Deep in the engineering spaces, a catastrophic turbine failure tore through the ship's vitals. The sound was a sickening, metallic scream of high-speed steel disintegrating against steel. As the ship drifted, suddenly emasculated and dead in the water, a heavy, prophetic silence fell over the crew. They were forced into a humiliating return to the Bremerton dry dock, tethered to the shore by thick, umbilical-like power lines, to the radioman in the shack and the snipes in the Ferrier rooms. The message was clear. The California was a cursed vessel, commanded by men who carried misfortune in their wake like a foul smell. Throughout the summer of 1941, as the fleet played at war in the gunsmoke drills, a profound disconnect took hold. On the tactical maps, the war clique in Tokyo was rising like a fever. But on the streets of Honolulu and Long Beach, the sailors were engaged in a final fling of roses. They lived in a state of willful, desperate ignorance. Their world defined by the pursuit of radio girls and the transactional intimacy of Hotel Street. They navigated a landscape of overripe fish, bilge greens, and the neon-lit brothels of an authentic Americana. They sought refuge from the Aleutian stare of the Pacific in the bottom of a whiskey glass. They were preoccupied with petty grievances and romantic obsessions, treating the encroaching global conflict as a parody that would never truly touch their lives. This illusion of permanent youth and safety was finally shattered on November 1, 1941. The California was prepared to leave the West Coast for the last time, and the atmosphere on the pier was thick with a heavy, cinematic melancholy. The morning was a grey, biting chill, the air smelling of crude oil and the salty damp of the San Francisco fog. As the order came to single up all lines, the festive atmosphere of the previous night's liberty vanished. The gangway was pulled in with a hollow, final thud. Sailors stood at the rail, watching the wedding cake beauty of the city skyline recede. Their eyes were fixed on the Golden Gate Bridge, a 4,200-foot-long passage to an unknown abyss. One young radioman stood on the quarterdeck, his hands white-knuckled as he gripped the railing. He watched the highway back to his hometown, twisting like a snake through the distant Sierras, a road he now realized was becoming a ghost. Beside him, a seasoned petty officer whispered with chilling finality, "God damn it. There it goes. We are leaving, and I am never going to see the States again." The ship's bell tolled a slow, rhythmic cadence as the California cut through the swells. The transition from the promised land to the unforgiving environment of a fleet on the brink was absolute. They were no longer boys playing at sea. They were cogs in a 32,000-ton machine of war, steaming toward a midwatch on December 7th, where the dreams of the battleship Navy would be incinerated in a mushroom of orange flame. Now we return to the steel coffin of main radio, where the water is rising past the knees of the radioman and the lights are failing. The air, once a stagnant soup of ozone and Navy Joe, is now thick with the suffocating stench of fuel oil and the metallic tang of a dying ship. In the flickering yellow glow of the emergency lamps, the men look up at the ominously smooth underside of the armored hatch. It is dogged tight. There is no ladder to the surface, only the rhythmic, terrifying slop-slop of the Pacific surging through the open manholes of the torpedo defense system. The California is no longer a flagship. She is a 32,000-ton lead weight settling into the oily mud of the harbor. Outside, the world has dissolved into a cacophony of banshee wails from descending Zeros and the insane roar of the Arizona's final agony. For the radioman, the transition from the country club lethargy of a Sunday morning to the cold, wet reality of a tomb has been finalized. When the order to abandon ship finally filters down through the failing internal comms, it isn't a release. It is a frantic, slippery scramble through darkened, oil-slicked passageways where the old manuals have been replaced by a primal, white-knuckled fight for air. They emerge onto a deck that is no longer teak-white and proud, but a scorched listing platform of chaos where the boat deck burns bare feet. The water is littered with the remains of a world that was supposed to be invulnerable. The night of December 7th offers no sanctuary, only a descent into a collective dirge of hysteria. As the sun sets over the smoking ruins of Battleship Row, the fleet enters a state of psychological madness. Every shadow is a paratrooper. Every ripple in the water is a midget submarine. When a flight of American planes from the Enterprise attempts to land, the harbor erupts in a fierce kind of joy as sailors turn their unshielded guns on their own brothers. Tracers stitch the velvet Hawaiian sky in arcs of lethal neon, a violent eruption that signals the total death of the old Navy's spit and polish restraint. The survivors, coated in gummy black residue that clogs their eyes and ears, realize that the country club expectations of Honolulu have been incinerated. They are no longer men o' war's men in a peacetime pageant. They are the hardened, suspicious remnants of a defeated caste. They are left to scrub the oil from their skin with kerosene and sleep in the sweaty confines of the sub-base, nursing a sickness of heart that no amount of naval discipline can cure. The death of the Queen was a slow and humiliating spectacle. In the months following the attack, the California was transformed from a symbol of national grandeur into a monstrous and cluttered barge. To raise her from the mud of Pearl Harbor, engineers had to construct massive wooden cofferdams. These were gigantic, tooth-like structures that ringed the sunken hull, while her proud tripod masts were chopped down to the deck. She looked like a barnacle-encrusted grey whale being butchered on a hostile beach. The austere beauty of the ship was stripped away in the Bremerton dry dock. It was replaced by the high-pitched rat-a-tat-tat of pneumatic hammers and the sickly sweet smell of burning metal as yard workers welded her back together. She was physically emasculated, her old-world silhouette sacrificed for the brutal and utilitarian requirements of modern war. By the time she emerged, she was a hybrid creature of the industrial age. She was now bristling with 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. She had become a lady-in-waiting to the aircraft carriers that had usurped her throne. The era of the battleship navy, where the majestic line of battle was the ultimate arbiter of sea power, was buried under the cluttered arsenal of a new and unromantic reality. But the prune barge had one final, cinematic appointment with destiny. We must look forward to the pitch-black morning of October 25, 1944. The setting was the narrow and claustrophobic waters of the Surigao Strait. The California sat in a perfect and lethal formation. She was crossing the T of a Japanese task force in the final line of battle engagement in human history. The ghosts of December 7th seemed to haunt the humid air as the fire control computers locked onto the silhouette of the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. At 03:53 in the morning, the order was given. The California's 14-inch guns, the very weapons that were silent and locked during the Pearl Harbor slaughter, erupted in a mighty thunderclap. The muzzle flashes lit up the strait like a strobe light from hell. She poured 63 heavy shells into the Yamashiro. The macabre fountains of her dye-coated splashes marked the rhythm of a long-delayed vengeance. It was a bookend of fire. The ship that was once a useless and sinking hulk was now the instrument of a dying era's final, magnificent roar. As the Yamashiro rolled over and vanished into the dark, the lost crew of 1941 was finally answered by the thunder of the very steel that had once been their coffin. The legacy of the California and her sisters is not found in the wedding cake beauty of their pre-war silhouettes. It is found in the cold and hardening fury of the men they forged. By the time the ship was decommissioned in 1947 and sold for scrap in 1959, the battleship era had been entirely relegated to the realm of myth. The country club navy of Glenn Miller and the old-school sailor had been replaced by a global and mechanical enterprise of carriers and jets. It was a world where the Aleutian stare of the veteran had become the standard gaze of the professional. The 2,403 dead of Pearl Harbor remain the silent anchors of this transition. Their lives were the price paid for the Navy's move from a rigid and stratified bureaucracy to a modern and lethal machine. As the California's bell tolls one last time in a quiet Sacramento park, it rings for a world that vanished in 45 minutes of orange flame. It is a reminder that the austere beauty of the battleship was merely a facade for a war that demanded everything. It was a pride that was finally and violently redeemed in the dark waters of a distant strait. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.